The French Dispatch was directed by Wes Anderson. So many actors appear in this movie: Bill Murray, Adrian Brody, Owen Wilson, Tilda Swinton, Frances McDormand, Benicio del Toro, Timothy Chalamet, Jeffrey Wright, Saoirse Ronan, Lea Seydoux, world-class actor Edward Norton, Christoph Waltz, Willem Dafoe, and that's just to name a few. Some of these actors are even cameos. The film The French Dispatch depicts both the stories told and the process going into writing the final issue of a 20th century French magazine of the Liberty, Kansas Evening Sun called The French Dispatch. The French Dispatch magazine chronicles events concerning the arts, world politics, and food. The film starts showing editor-in-chief of the French Dispatch, Arthur Howitzer Jr., has passed away. In Howitzer Jr.'s will, he stated that upon his death, publication of the French Dispatch is to cease. The film shows recreations of stories told in the final issue of the French Dispatch, including a renowned painter locked away in an insane asylum, a group of students forming a revolution to overthrow their government, and a chef's involvement in the search to find a police commissioner's kidnapped son. Wes Anderson is my all-time favorite director. I love his stylized sense of filmmaking, I love the deadpan sense of humor, and I love the tremendous amount of heart injected into the story of each of his films. I love Wes Anderson's films. Wes Anderson has directed many incredible films. His most notable include Fantastic Mr. Fox, The Grand Budapest Hotel, The Royal Tenenbaums, and Rushmore. Now on this list is The French Dispatch, a new film I consider to be one of his best films. As usual with any of Wes Anderson films, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies to be found in The French Dispatch. That's common in a lot of his films: deadpan dialogue, a pastel color palette, symmetrical shots, colorful costumes, tracking shots, and precocious child characters. But with all those similarities to his other works, I think this is one of Wes Anderson's most different and daring films. This is an anthology film, so the story gets an opportunity to switch around with characters and themes a lot and try new things out every once in a while. There's a surprising amount of black and white scenes for a director who so often uses pastel color palettes for set designs. The plot is significantly less character development driven as some of his other films, like The Royal Tenenbaums, which is completely based on character development. And there's even this incredible scene utilizing 2D animation in the style of comic books. I'm not even kidding. One thing I liked a lot about The French Dispatch is how we barely see our main character, Arthur Howitzer Jr., who is the editor-in-chief at The French Dispatch. At the beginning of the film, we see that he passes away, and so we travel through the events written on by the writers of his magazine in the final issue of his magazine. So, although we don't see much of Howitzer Jr. himself, we live through his work and see the legacy he's created in his lifetime, the team of great expatriate writers he's assembled, the lives he's affected, how history has been indirectly influenced by his magazine. That's how we connect with our main character, through his work and legacy. And I think the screenwriters of this film did this in a masterful way that really worked out well. I found the use of color in this film to be very interesting. Everything taking place in the real world is in color, and everything in the articles told within the French Dispatch is in black and white, with the exception of a few color shots. It's established near the beginning that color represents the present, while black and white represents the past. So while the stories told in the magazine will someday become stories of history and the past, the few colored snapshots seen within the stories are what's immortalized through memory. This film is very funny, especially the first story told in the magazine called The Concrete Masterpiece, which I found to be immensely funny. The first story tells of an artist in an insane asylum for double homicide who gets famous painting an abstract picture of his lover posing as a nude model. And when I say abstract painting, I mean a very abstract painting. And in this story, we see a lot of pretty funny critiques on the inanity of the almost worship given to modern art, the hypocrisy of art critics, and the great deal of hyperbole going into the description of modern art. With the exception of Wes Anderson's previous film, Isle of Dogs, which had some pretty bland, forgettable, charmless characters, Wes Anderson, in all of his movies that aren't Isle of Dogs, creates a cast of likable and colorful characters. On some occasions, in some of his films, he creates some of his best, most likable, most colorful, most memorable characters. Characters like Monsieur Gustave H. of the Grand Budapest Hotel, Max Fisher of Rushmore, Steve Zissou of The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, and Royal Tenenbaum of the Royal Tenenbaums. Adding to this list is Roebuck Wright of the French Dispatch. Roebuck Wright, played by Jeffrey Wright, is supposedly one of the most well-renowned journalists working at the French Dispatch, partly because of his typographic memory, meaning he can remember text very well, almost photographically. Despite being well-renowned, Roebuck Wright writes food critiques. In this film, Roebuck Wright writes the third story, titled The Private Dining Room of the Police Commissioner, an article telling of a chef's involvement in the rescue of a police commissioner's beloved son. Jeffrey Wright portrays this character so well and made this character who he is. Especially with one monologue in particular that Jeffrey Wright nailed in delivering in such a powerful way. Speaking of characters, something Wes Anderson does very well in all of his non-Isle of Dogs films is give such a vivid charm to the world of each one of his films with every single character, including side characters. Everyone has their own little quirk, and because everyone has their own little quirk, we therefore assume they have their own story. And because everyone has their own story, the world of the film feels more authentic because everyone truly matters. In the French Dispatch, there's a journalist with a typographic memory, a journalist who hasn't written anything in years, but still roams the halls of the French Dispatch, a precocious child whose entire education has come from a police station, a well-renowned artist imprisoned for sawing off two men's heads, a journalist who, despite preaching journalistic neutrality, often has a large effect on the events of her story through major interference, a blue-eyed prostitute who fell in with the wrong crowd, and the editor-in-chief of the French Dispatch, Arthur Howitzer Jr., whose mantra seems to be, just try to make it sound like you wrote it that way on purpose. You see, no matter how small the part, everyone has personality, everyone has a story. No matter how little on-screen time, every character is memorable in some way. If I really had to find a problem with the French Dispatch, it would be that I didn't quite enjoy the second story quite as much as the first and third. The second story, titled Revisions to a Manifesto, chronicles a group of children forming a revolution against their supposedly tyrannical government, and also shows how the journalist from the French Dispatch, played by Frances McDormand, who is observing the story as it unfolds, has trouble maintaining journalistic neutrality when faced with the idea of her effect on history. This story was funny and all, and it had some funny critiques on revolutions and revolutionaries, how, despite saying they're all free thinkers, they're really just copying other people's ideas and being yes men to another sort of idea. But I felt this whole story was somehow unsatisfying in comparison to the first story, which I found immensely funny, and the third story, which was my favorite part of the whole film. I'll give The French Dispatch an A. Guys, I really think you ought to see The French Dispatch in theaters as soon as possible, because this is a splendid film. As far as recommendations go, all I can say is, go see some other Wes Anderson films. Some of my favorite of his include Fantastic Mr. Fox, The Grand Budapest Hotel, Moonrise Kingdom, Rushmore, and my all-time favorite of his, The Royal Tenenbaums. I watched it last night, still one of my favorite movies of all time. Also, you should go see Asteroid City, which is going to be Wes Anderson's newest film coming in 2022. starring Tom Hanks, Margot Robbie, and Scarlett Johansson. Well, that just about does it for my thoughts on The French Dispatch. Before you leave, why don't you tell me what you thought of The French Dispatch? Or, if you haven't seen it, tell me what your favorite Wes Anderson film is. I'd say mine is The Royal Tenenbaums. After you tell me about that, you can head on out. Stay safe and watch good movies. Bye!